Hello. I decided to start putting together some of our birth story. It is March 3rd, 2021, so Abbie is now 3 months old, and I feel like I'm finally at a place where I can start to dive in a little bit into the story that has been our last 7 or 8 months. So, and hopefully too, this may help someone that has a heart warrior in the future or discovers that they're pregnant or a friend is pregnant with a heart warrior, or someone who has a initial false diagnosis, or even if you were part of our journey, or a family member or a friend that was praying for Abbie. Hopefully this will give you a little more insight into what was going on, especially with COVID. We weren't able to have a lot of people in our circle. So, I guess we'll start part one. I'll break these videos into different parts so they don't get too long. But part one is just talking about her diagnosis. So if you don't know, Abbie has been diagnosed with transposition of the Great Arteries. So she was born with that, and she's right here. She's swinging away, happy as a clam. And she's doing great now. But she has had a long journey, and she's a very strong little baby. So her diagnosis is transposition of the Great Arteries, or TGA, and that basically means that her aorta and her pulmonary artery never completely transposed, or transversed, so they grew in the wrong positions, which basically led to her lungs oxygenating blood and then sending it back to her lungs, and her body having deoxygenated blood and sending it back to her body. So they weren't switching over like they were supposed to. And that happens, I guess, 1 in every 4,000 to 6,000 live births. And so it's pretty rare, but not extremely rare. And it is a congenital heart defect. So congenital heart defects in general happen, like 1 in every 100 babies has some kind of congenital heart defect, but they can range in severity. And TGA is one of the more severe ones. It's technically incompatible with life outside of surgery. So most of the time when these babies do not get the help they need through heart surgery and fixing their problem, they're not able to breathe, not able to circulate oxygenated blood the way that they should. So TGA is a complex one, but thankfully there's a surgery now, ever since the late 80s, that has proved very effective in these kids' lives, called the ASO, or the switch operation. So basically, our pregnancy was pretty normal all the way up until the 20-week scan. I had a lot of morning sickness and some food aversions and, different small things that were uncomfortable, but pretty normal. And we did not know the sex of the baby at 20 weeks. We were actually hoping to just kind of wait longer, perhaps the whole time, to find out the sex of the baby. But when the 20-week scan came around, we went, and because of COVID, I could only go to my appointments. My husband was not able to. So the initial scan showed what's called an EIF, or a spot on the heart. Everything else looked good. It was just this one spot on the heart. And so, like a week after the scan, I got a call from one of the OBs in my office, and we have at the office I was going to, there's 5 OBs, and they switch out. So one of them called me and was just like, hey, nothing to worry about, but there's an EIF, like a small spot on the baby's heart. Most likely it's a calcium deposit, and there's nothing really to be concerned about. A lot of these times the calcium deposit will go away by the time you give birth, and it's totally not anything that you should worry about. However, there's a small chance that it's something more than that, so we do recommend that you go to a level 2 ultrasound, and we don't have that kind of machinery, but we'd be happy to refer you out to Johnstown, and they'd be where you would get the next level. And so, I talked to my husband. I was like, not a big deal, but let's go ahead and get this just in case. And they referred us out. We went August 26th to Johnstown. Thankfully, I brought my husband. He drove us there, and he stayed outside near a park where there was parking because there wasn't parking around the hospital. So even though it wasn't, a huge deal, I'm so glad that he still came. And even though COVID, he couldn't come inside, I'm glad that he was outside waiting, because we got in, I go into the ultrasound, it all starts totally normal. The ultrasound tech was checking all the limbs and they looked good. She checked the brain, looked good, the stomach, all the organs looked good, until she got to the heart, and she just said, I'm having a really hard time looking at the heart. I can't see anything. It's just the position that the baby's in, so let's try to move you. And the initial scanning of all the other stuff probably took an hour, and then I had an additional 2 hours of just moving side to side and getting in all different sorts of positions so that the tech could see the heart. And, I didn't think anything of it. I just thought, oh, it's hard to see the heart. The baby's in a weird position. She's moving too much, or he or she, because we didn't know the gender at the time. But the longer it went, the more I was like, you have to have seen something, right? Like, I don't know why I'm still here. And so the tech eventually, she's like, okay, you can call your husband now. I still can't see everything, so we're just gonna get the doctor to come in, and hopefully he'll be able to see something. And, at that point, it had been 3 hours. He finally comes in, and he sits down and kind of talks to the tech as if I'm not in the room. They're kind of mumbling under their breath, but I'm right there, so I was, hearing everything. And he kept saying, so you think, and she's like, yeah. And then he was like, yeah, I see. And she was like, yeah. And then, so they wouldn't finish their sentences, and I was just like, what is going on? And then the tech kept pointing out that our baby's hands were clenched the whole time. The whole time. She kept saying, yep, the hands have been closed the last 3 hours. Hands have been closed. There's been no open hands. And I was just like, why does she keep saying that? She probably said it 5 or 6 times. And you just kept saying, okay, I agree with your thoughts. Do you think it's transposition? And she was like, yeah. And they just went back and forth. And I was like, what is transposition? Why does it matter that the baby's hands are closed? And then finally, the doctor asked, where's your husband? And I said, oh, he's in the car. There wasn't parking, or, because we couldn't come in, because he couldn't come in because of COVID. And he said, okay, well, let's get your husband in here. And I was like, my heart just dropped. I was like, oh, no. Well, the COVID at that point was, in August 2020, is high alert. People aren't coming in. Husbands are definitely not coming in. There must be something wrong if he's allowed to come in. And, we called Alex, and he said, there wasn't parking near the hospital, so I ended up at a park a little while away, and maybe 5 minutes or so, and the doctor was like, okay, well, we'll just talk about it on the phone then, if that's all right. And I was like, well, yeah, what's wrong? And he said, so your baby's heart is not supplying oxygen the way that it needs to. It's pushing oxygen here, but it should be pushing oxygen here. Do you see? And he pointed it out on the ultrasound. And it's silly now, but I just remember asking, is that a problem? And Alex did too. He's like, yeah, does it matter? If the heart is pushing blood, isn't that good? And the doctor was like, no, this is very bad. And he was very straightforward with it. It's like, this is very concerning. And, this heart defect is something that will require surgery. But there are a few other things here that we see that make us think it's not only a heart defect, but that your baby has trisomy 18. And we were like, what? Why? That doesn't make any sense at all. Like, I don't think I've have anyone in my family with any genetic abnormalities or anything. And he said, well, your baby has a low birth weight, which I did know about, but I attribute it to my cycles being longer than are the typical cycles, so I knew that was fine. And he said, and your baby's hands have been clenched for the last 3 hours. And we said, okay, but I mean, we were just confused. Like, how do you make that diagnosis with such little information? And he said, it might not be, but you're going to need to know your options, and we'll send you across the street to get an amniocentesis if that's something you agree to do. And so we talked through the different things that we would do next. And I mean, at this point, when he said trisomy 18, I had some experience with knowing what trisomy disorders were, and I did know that trisomy 18 is typically associated with fatality, and that the children do not live very long if they make it to birth. And so I, asked him, does that mean we'll just have a few days with the baby? And he said yes. And if it's trisomy 18, probably a few hours if they make it even to birth. And I was just like devastated, I was trying to hold it together because I knew the doctor would only be in there for a few minutes, and we needed to get all the information we could. But it was very, very difficult. I felt so happy going into the ultrasound and seeing all the things, and baby was moving and alive and had all her fingers and toes, and the tech had written down on a piece of paper for us whether it was a boy or a girl, and I had that piece of paper in my hand, and we were going to go home and open it and celebrate. And now just to be told, no, your plans are now to get a blood test to see if your baby has this fatal condition, or if your baby just has a fatal heart defect. So it was not really a lot of good options. But he talked to us about amniocentesis, which is where they could go in utero and take a sample of the amniotic fluid. But we asked about the risks of that, and the risk, I think, was 1 in 1,000 will become stillbirth because of the amniocentesis affecting them. And we were like, well, how rare is the heart defect? And he said 1 in 6,000. And I said, well, if we already have the 1 in 6,000 for sure, we're not going to take a chance with 1 in 1,000. That seems dumb. So we ended up not doing that. And I want to make clear that that may not be the call everyone makes. That was just something I didn't know anything about, and it felt right for us not to do the amniocentesis. But if you've done that, then that was your decision, and I'm not passing judgment on that at all. For us, though, it seemed like too high of a risk since we already had something so high risk that was confirmed. So he sent me across the street, and he was as direct and polite as he could be. I really appreciated his frankness. But it was really hard, going across the street and getting my blood drawn after I was bawling my eyes out, asking these awful questions about these two options that didn't seem great. Neither one of them, to just have heart defect or have heart defect and this genetic abnormality that, had no hope. And it just all seemed like a lot. So I got my blood drawn and then called Alex, and he picked me up, and we went back to the park where he was parked, and we just both sat and cried. And we prayed. But it was it was the most difficult thing I've ever been through, for sure. But eventually we made it home and got home at like 5 p.m. We just went to bed and cried and like would try to sleep a little bit here and there, but then would wake up and cry, and I just felt so void of feeling. Like I thought maybe beforehand I was like, oh, maybe I've been depressed before, I don't know, but I mean, now I know that that was deep depression, and that was deep void of any emotion, all feeling. I just felt like a hollowed out, like black hole, and had all of these awful thoughts that I would entertain, like, what if the baby doesn't make it to birth, and how would I deal with that, and what do I do? How would I know if the baby, like I was just told that the baby might not make it to birth, but I'm already 5 months pregnant, so how do I know if the baby is okay? How do I tell if the heart is beating? How do I know if I need to go to the hospital? And so it was all just very overwhelming. So yeah, at home, we just kind of melted. And then the next day we did reach out to our pastor and his wife, who were able to come over and pray with us and encourage us that day, with hope and just the promises that God has for our future. And that he has good plans for us, and plans that are prosperous and not to harm us, and that we are strong, and that we can get through this, and that there can be healing. So our prayers shifted to healing, and specifically mine shifted that even if our baby did have trisomy 18, that the blood test would not show it, because everything I had read online and everything that that doctor was telling us, and then everything that was confirmed by my visit to the OB a few days later, was saying that a heart defect in a baby could, it could allow for them to have heart surgery, which could fix the problem, and that there was a good outcome in those situations. But a genetic abnormality with a heart defect was a totally different story, and that most likely we would not be eligible for surgery or any kind of treatment other than hospice. And so, yeah, my prayer for 10 days while we were waiting for those tests to show like high risk or low risk of trisomy, my prayer was just that the test would come back low risk, and that even if there was genetic abnormality, we would make it to birth with a plan, and that along the way I would convince enough people to give us the heart surgery that it wouldn't matter, and we could almost pull a fast one over on the surgeons or something, which is silly now, but that's what I was praying, because I didn't want to be in a position where I was told there was no hope, and I was carrying a baby that wouldn't be eligible for surgery. So it gave me a lot of empathy for people in that situation. And for us, 10 days later, we got the call that we were low risk and that she didn't have trisomy 18, but that because we had declined the amniocentesis, they couldn't be sure that there weren't other genetic abnormalities, and we would have to wait till birth to see if she was actually going to be eligible for the heart surgery. So in our case, that did happen. She was eligible and she did have the surgery, but it gave me so much empathy for people that don't have that option, that are diagnosed with a genetic abnormality, just because that test comes back a different answer, and all of a sudden their hope is taken away because our medical system doesn't know how to, or doesn't care to provide this extra care that these kids need. And I've definitely been able to do more research on it and see that there is so much hope for these trisomy kids statistically. There's better options, and these hospitals really should give parents more hope than they're currently being given. And it was heartbreaking. But anyway, our diagnosis, we had we found out like 10 days later. In the midst of that time, I went to my OB here again and talked to her about what our options would be, because I was still a little confused, just because I wasn't in this mind frame to ask a lot of questions when they told us the diagnosis. So I was able to talk to her about what would actually happen. Like, if the test comes back high risk and we do have trisomy 18, what would happen? What would I do? Who would I go see? How would I advocate for my baby? And then if the test came back low risk and there wasn't a trisomy disorder involved, what would happen then? And she had all these hopeful things to say about, okay, well, the heart defect, if it comes back low risk, then you would go to McGee, and that's where you would deliver the baby, and then they'd transfer to Children's, and you'd get the heart surgery, and you'd be with the baby for a month. But when it came to if the test comes back high risk for trisomy, there's not a lot that can be done. And I mean, I'm so glad that I knew, but it's just also so frustrating when you're in that position and you don't know what your future holds. Like, if you have any possibility of accessing the care that your child needs. It's so awful, and I would not wish that upon anyone. It's just really traumatizing. And so, anyway, we continued to just talk about Abbie's diagnosis after she was kind of cleared of the high risk. We made a plan. So after that came back, we got another call and then set up appointments at McGee where we would give birth, and then also at Children's where our baby would be transferred after birth in order to have the surgery. So I think that's good for the first part. I'll make another video and we'll pick up with the talking about like preparation for the surgery and preparation for the delivery, and then how everything went afterwards. But thanks for listening so far. Little Abbie bear. Cutie pie. Alright, talk to you soon. Bye.